Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this series of video lectures is on bioethics. These video lectures are for the course on church, society, and ethical issues in Asia at the East Asia School of Theology. Bioethics and reproductive ethics are some of today's most difficult ethical issues. The reason why they are so difficult is because they often involve cutting-edge technologies as well as decisions that literally involve life and death. Some of these medical technologies and techniques are so new that there are not yet many laws or ethical codes to regulate their practice. Nor have philosophers, theologians, medical leaders, and other stakeholders yet come to any kind of consensus about how these technologies and techniques should be used. Many of these technologies give us an almost godlike ability to decide who lives and who dies. And when these issues involve making decisions about whether to prolong the lives of loved ones who are suffering, these decisions can become quite excruciating. So how are Christians to know what decision to make with regard to these issues? That is what we will explore during these video lectures. So in these video lectures, I will be looking at 4 basic issues related to bioethics and reproductive ethics. These 4 issues are abortion, in vitro fertilization or IVF, genetic engineering, and euthanasia. So as I will look at each of these issues in turn, and as we go through these issues, I will identify some of the core questions that underlie these ethical issues. I will also identify some biblical values that can help us and those whom we are trying to counsel to make better decisions on these issues. The first issue I want us to look at is the question of abortion. Abortion is the intentional ending of a pregnancy before a child has been born. This means that abortions are different from miscarriages when a pregnancy ends before 23 weeks before the child is fully developed. Abortions are also different from stillbirths, which is when a mother gives birth to a dead child. Abortions are different from miscarriages and stillbirths because miscarriages and stillbirths are not the result of intentional action, while an abortion involves the intentional destruction of an unborn baby. So before we really dive into this issue, let's look at some different definitions. So an ovum is an unfertilized egg that is released from a woman's ovary during her menstrual cycle. A sperm is the male reproductive cell. A zygote is an egg that has been successfully fertilized by a sperm. An embryo is an unborn child from the moment of conception until the 8th week of development. And a fetus is an unborn child from the 8th week of development until childbirth. Now, the words embryo and fetus are the technical scientific terms for an unborn child and are considered neutral terms. The term unborn child is not considered neutral, but I will use this term in this lecture because I believe this is an accurate description of an embryo or fetus. So at present, there are two different methods for abortion. The first is surgical abortion. This is when a doctor or some other person removes the unborn child by surgical means. The exact method for surgical abortion depends on how advanced the pregnancy is. If the abortion occurs very early in the pregnancy, the child may be vacuumed out of the womb. But if the abortion takes place later in the pregnancy, the child may actually be dismembered, or his or her head may be intentionally crushed. Many of the methods that are used in surgical abortion are, in fact, quite gruesome, but we need to be aware of this reality. And the second major method of abortion is what's known as medical abortion. A medical abortion occurs when a pregnant woman takes medication to induce an abortion. Again, medical abortion is different from miscarriage because a medical abortion is the intentional act of ending a pregnancy. Regardless of the method used for abortion, the result is the same. The pregnancy is ended and the unborn child is killed. Now, let's look at the history of abortion, okay? Abortion has been practiced for thousands of years and was practiced during the 1st century when the church came into existence. At that time, infanticide was also a common practice. Christians began rescuing children who had been abandoned in the open to die from exposure. Christians were also opposed to abortion from the earliest days of Christianity, as can be seen in the following quotes. The way of death is filled with people who are murderers of children and abortionists of God's creatures. You shall not slay a child by abortion. And these two quotes come from the Didache, which was a set of religious instructions for Christian converts. And the Didache was written in the 2nd century AD. For those who conceal sexual wantonness by taking stimulating drugs to bring on an abortion wholly lose their own humanity along with the fetus. Now, this quote is from Clement of Alexandria in his essay, Pedagogus, which was also written in the 2nd century AD. For us, since homicide is forbidden, abortion is not even permitted, for to prevent its being born is an acceleration of homicide, and there is no difference whether one snuffs out a life already born or disturbs one that is in the process of being born. For he is also a man who is about to be one, just as every fruit also exists in the seed. And this quote comes from the essay Apology, which was written by Tertullian, also in the 2nd century AD. Abortion was outlawed in the Roman Empire in the year AD 211. and it was also illegal throughout the Middle Ages. Jurists during the Middle Ages often equated abortion with homicide. English common law, which began in the Middle Ages and developed over the course of many centuries, regarded abortion after quickening, which is 40 days into the pregnancy for boys and 80 days into the pregnancy for girls, as illegal. Many Western nations began passing laws in the 19th century to make abortion illegal. In the 20th century, the Soviet Union was the first nation to legalize abortion in 1920. China legalized abortion in 1957, but it was not until the sexual revolution began in the 1960s that many more countries began legalizing abortion, including Great Britain in 1967, the United States in 1973, Singapore in 1974, Vietnam in 1975, Mongolia in 1989, Germany in 1992, Cambodia in 1997, Nepal in 2002, New Zealand in 2020, and South Korea and Thailand in 2021. To date, 66 countries have legalized abortion. So now let's look at some biblical passages that are related to abortion. The first one, the truth is, the Bible says very little about abortion. Exodus 21:22 through 25 describes a situation where two men who are fighting strike a pregnant woman, causing her to give birth prematurely. There is some debate about whether these verses are talking about a miscarriage or an unborn child, but it's very interesting that this passage is where we get the first mention of the phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is, and that phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is talking about how punishments need to be crafted in such a way that they fit the crime. And it's interesting that that concept is first found in the Bible with relation to the loss of a human life inside a mother's womb. We find no other mention in the Bible that remotely describes abortion. However, we find many passages in the Bible that illustrate God's concern for the unborn, including Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, Jeremiah 1:5, and Luke chapter 1, verses 39 through 45. This passage from Luke describes Mary's visit to Elizabeth when Elizabeth's baby, John the Baptist, leaped for joy upon Mary's arrival, because at this time, Mary was pregnant with Jesus. These passages may not convince committed abortion rights supporters that abortion is biblically wrong, which is why I highlighted the long history of Christian opposition to abortion, beginning in the earliest years of the Christian community. So, with regard to the abortion debate, there are two key ethical questions. The first one is, when does life begin? And the second question is, when is abortion morally permissible? The first question is perhaps the single most important question in the abortion debate, because how you answer the first question will strongly influence how you answer the second question. And then the first question often leads us to yet another question, which is, what is a person? Many modern definitions of personhood focus on the ability to be self-aware, to make one's own choices, and the ability to express oneself. This definition is often collectively described as personal autonomy, which we look at in greater detail in our lesson on sexuality and gender. So let's go back to the first question, which is, when does life begin? In the Middle Ages, life was believed to begin at quickening, which was the moment when a mother could begin to feel the baby moving inside her. This was believed to occur around 40 days after conception for boys and 80 days for girls. Many Jewish rabbis have also held this view for many centuries. One measure of life that is sometimes used is viability. That is, when an unborn baby is able to survive on his or her own outside of the mother's womb. Thanks to medical advances, this point is coming earlier and earlier in the pregnancy, as preemies show us. However, this definition is problematic since viability will continue to change as medical technology continues to advance. Now, Texas, my home state, has a form of this definition because in the year 2021, Governor Greg Abbott signed the heartbeat bill, which makes abortion illegal after a baby's heart starts to beat, which occurs around 6 weeks into the pregnancy. Those who support abortion often argue that human life is more than mere biological life. They go on to argue that it is culture or society that makes us humans. Therefore, they believe that abortion is permissible since the unborn child isn't really a human being until after the child is born. In fact, some ethicists who hold this view argue that it's morally acceptable to kill a newborn child up to 2 years after the baby is born. Others who are pro-life argue that life begins at conception, when the sperm and the egg unite. At that moment, a new organism comes into existence, an organism that has a completely unique set of DNA. This definition of humanity is based on the genetic definition, which says that any creature that possesses human DNA is a human being and is therefore a person. While the questions of when life begins and what makes someone a person are crucial questions in the abortion debate, another equally important question is, when is abortion permissible? Under what circumstances is it morally acceptable to have an abortion? This question is one that needs to be answered by each person, regardless of how he or she answers the other two questions. Even some Christians believe that abortion is acceptable under certain conditions. Like many other moral issues, there is a continuum of circumstances when people consider abortion to be a morally acceptable course of action. Some people would argue that abortion is acceptable under any and all circumstances. This can include aborting a child because having a child will disrupt the mother's career, because the mother is not financially prepared to bear the cost of raising a child, or because the father doesn't want a child, or the mother doesn't think the father is suitable. Others argue that abortion is acceptable in cases of rape or incest. And it should be noted that of women who do seek an abortion at the present time, only about 2% do so because of rape or incest. Others would say that abortion is permissible to save the life of the mother. And the reality is that some pregnancies do threaten the life of the mother. For example, ectopic pregnancies, which occur when a fertilized egg implants itself inside the womb, usually in the fallopian tubes. Here, some argue that the mother's life is more important than the baby's life. In that case, while the abortion is a sad occurrence in which the unborn child will never know the joys of life, the mother, who is already part of a web of relationships and who already has a number of responsibilities, is able to continue living and can have another child if she chooses to become pregnant again. And still others would say that abortion is acceptable in the case to prevent birth defects. One of the major arguments that was used in the 1960s to persuade states to legalize abortion was the argument of birth defects. News reporters and television networks that were sympathetic to abortion rights began airing news reports about women who gave birth to children with birth defects to put a human face on abortion. These news stories included reports about women whose pregnancies were affected by thalidomide, a condition, a medication that was often prescribed at the time to help women with nausea during their pregnancies. Thousands of babies were born with horrible birth defects, including brain damage and deformed limbs. Even though the medicine was pulled from shelves in the early 1960s, the impression these deformed children left on the public imagination was so strong that pro-abortion activists used these tragic births to argue for the legalization of abortion. In addition, there was an epidemic of German measles rubella, another disease that causes birth defects in babies. Depending on how severe German measles rubella is and how early it strikes during the pregnancy, German measles rubella can cause babies to be born blind, deaf, with heart problems, or mentally retarded. If it strikes early enough in the pregnancy, German measles rubella can also cause the baby to die. And this rubella epidemic occurred in several ways during the 1960s, which was the period when abortion rights activists were agitating and demonstrating and trying to advocate the adoption of abortion laws. So pro-abortion activists also used this rubella epidemic to successfully argue for the legalization of abortion. Now, as a personal note, I just want to add that my mother had German measles rubella while she was pregnant with me. And therefore, I was born deaf in both eyes. I became blind in my right eye when I was about 2 years old, which is sometimes what happens with rubella babies. And I had a heart defect that required an open heart surgery before I was 2 years old. When I was born, the doctors did not expect me to live. Yet I have been alive for more than 55 years. So I want to add that personal note because I confess that this issue is quite personal to me. Many people in the general public believe that these hard cases of rape, incest, and birth defects are responsible for 25% of abortion. Some believe they make up as much as 50% of all abortions. But the reality is that these cases make up less than 6% of all abortions nationwide, worldwide. During elections so this slide, okay. So during elections in November of 2022, voters in several states in the United States rejected initiatives to either outlaw abortion in their state or to amend their state constitution to outlaw abortion. In light of the fact that many people in the general public actually support abortion, we have to ask ourselves the question, why are women getting abortions? And this is where the pastoral dimension comes in, because in many cases, women are getting abortions for various reasons that do make a lot of sense to them. For example, some women get abortions because their boyfriends or husbands pressure or force them to. In some nations, such as China, this pressure comes from other family members, such as parents or in-laws. Some women get abortions because they are in abusive relationships. These women genuinely think they're helping their unborn children because they fear their unborn children will suffer abuse too if they're born. Some women get abortions because they don't think they're ready to take on the enormous responsibility of motherhood. Perhaps they don't think they're financially prepared or mature enough. And some women get abortions because they don't think the time is right for them to have a child. Yeah, this can be a selfish reason for some women, but for others, they may feel that they have other major issues to deal with in their lives, and they don't have the time, energy, or resources to care for a child properly. So this slide shows some reasons why women choose to have abortion. So we need to let women know, even before they have problem pregnancies, that there are many people who are willing and able to help them, and that there are definitely alternatives to abortion, including adoption. Above all, we need to point them to the truth that the Lord provides for all who trust in his care. So, when people whom you are discipling are struggling with the issue of abortion, what will you tell them? And if you yourself ever struggle with the issue of abortion, how will you make your decision? As we consider the issue of abortion, the most important question is, when does life begin? While the Bible does not specify when life began, we do know that the unborn child has a unique set of genes, And we know that at a certain point in the pregnancy, the baby's heart will begin beating. This means the unborn child is a separate human being. Even though the unborn child is dependent upon his or her mother, we know that under normal circumstances, that unborn child will one day grow to become a fully independent adult. We also see how the Bible testifies to God's concern for the unborn. The other important issue we need to address when talking with those who are contemplating abortion is to take the fears these women face seriously and to speak to these fears. So I hope that this video helps you to better understand more about what abortion is, and I hope it helps you to have a better understanding of the core values that are involved in the abortion issue, as well as some biblical principles and biblical values that can help us and those whom we are counseling to make better decisions about abortion. And now we are going to go to the second video lecture in this series on bioethics. So please go to the second lecture.